Today we're talking about one of our favorite topics, and that is micromanagement.
Taking control, overbearing, overpowering, ineffective, and often annoying.
Today is a really good day. The boss is out of the office today. We are getting so much done.
They've learned an ineffective style of managing. It's pretty simple.
You should not micromanage. You must stop that behavior of micromanaging.
We want to create workplaces that are humanized. So we want to see workplaces where people are sharing information, where people are supporting one another to grow, where people are leaning in for the sake of the team.
On one hand, I'm going to get rid of some significant portion of your workforce, which is going to throw you into a tailspin of stress, anxiety, and obligation, because I'm upping what you're obligated to deliver. And also the ability to acquire the skills to manage that's going away too. We're not gonna pay for that. So what are we doing here? Hello, awesome humans. I am Chuck.
And I'm Andrew.
And we are the Mindful Business Alliance. We are committed to making work suck less.
Or as we say, humanizing the workplace.
And today we're talking about one of our favorite topics, a topic that we find ourselves talking about quite a bit, and that is micromanagement. So first of all, micromanagement, what do we mean, Andrew, when we say micromanagement? What are we talking about?
Taking control, overbearing, overpowering, micromanaging. We're talking about when leaders or colleagues invest too much time and energy in trying to manage things on behalf of other people to the point that it is ineffective and often annoying.
Annoying. Yeah, and even potentially soul-crushing.
I think potentially, very likely, ultimately soul-crushing. Yes,
potentially, very likely, ultimately, magnificently soul-crushing.
I mean, have you ever heard somebody say, I love how my boss micromanages me? It is just so great. It makes me feel all chipper and happy.
No. In fact, I remember back in the days when I was an IT consultant, there were a number of offices I would walk into. And there were days when I would walk in, and mostly I was dealing with the administrative staff. And they'd say, oh, thank goodness you're here today. Today is a really good day. The boss is out of the office today. We are getting so much done.
That's just awful, isn't it? It's so relatable. I don't know.
Well, and you could tell because also on the same days, if the boss was there, I wouldn't get as much done. The boss would often pull me aside and interrogate me and ask me a bunch of questions. They're paying me by the hour. And a lot of that hour was spent in conversations with the boss that I did not need to have. I knew what the job was. It's
so fascinating, isn't it? Like, where does it come from? Like, why do these things happen? And that's probably a good place for us to explore. Like, kicking off this topic, micromanaging. What actually causes it? Like, what's going on with people who do things like the leader you're just talking about?
Yeah, well, I think the easy answer is, these are just people who are type A, or they're overly controlling. So there was a lot of conversation about this. People being OCD, obsessive compulsive. This is a person with control issues, and labeling this manager as having some kind of neurosis. That was often what was happening. There was something wrong with this person, that they're overly controlling. And the reason I object to that kind of labeling is first of all, I think that this trend of micromanaging is so common that if it were a disorder, everyone would have it.
Yeah, I think there's so many labels in there already that you kind of, you put out. And it's true. Like, I think the label is just micromanaging, right? It's not like there's necessarily something wrong with somebody. It's a behavior that they've learned. They've learned an ineffective style of managing. It's pretty simple.
There is some impulse behind it that I think is potentially problematic. So, for example, I think for some managers, they do micromanage because they don't feel trusting of their employees. They don't. They feel like if they take their eye off something, a problem will occur. So I think there's some legitimate anxieties that kind of underpin the behavior, and I think some people overdo it.
Hmm. Well, I think the key word here is behavior. What are people learning about how they're being rewarded? If you are a leader who is under, you know, very heavy pressure to perform or to deliver, if you have a leader above that leader who's not interested in the team dynamics at all, not interested in how is the team operating together, then you could see why somebody might overdo it in order to try to look okay to their ultimate boss. If information isn't being shared clearly, or if rewards are only given out for individual contributions, you can see how these things can get created just from a sort of a cultural perspective, never mind behavioral.
And I think you're pointing to something really important here too, because those incentives often show up very early in people's careers. This is part of where I think a lot of people get conditioned into the behaviors that lead to micromanagement. So, for example, a lot of these people who are now in management roles were individual contributors. Sometimes for many years, they were individual contributors and they were getting rewarded for achieving. They were getting rewarded for solving as many problems as they could. And suddenly they're in charge of other people and they have to let go of some of that control. And it's very hard to do. So this is where I want to give some latitude to people who are struggling with this, because letting go of that control is difficult. You do have to trust people. And sometimes you have to trust people that you don't have a lot of reason to trust. Maybe you haven't had an employee on your team for very long. You don't really know how they're going to perform. So if you have a high stakes project, maybe you want to control it a little more than you should.
Yeah, and I think that I'm with you on. I think giving people a bit of latitude here. If we don't teach people, how can they learn? If people don't have good role models for this, as you said, in early careers, we tend to learn how we are taught. You know, we tend to do what we saw others do when we were the juniors. And I'm sort of thinking of an analogy like if I get moved into a role and I have to learn a certain kind of coding, or if I have to learn a particular accounting technique, I'll probably get to go on a course and I'll get taught it and then I can do it. But as you and I see every day in our work, people get moved into these roles from the individual contributors, as you were saying before, into these leadership roles, and they're kind of expected to just know what to do. And I
Yeah.
think this is where cultures, organizations can really mess this up. There's sort of an assumption that people know how to adapt and suddenly think in new ways, suddenly not focus so much on the details that as they were before. But nobody's really telling them. We sort of have this assumption that people can just adapt. And, you know, it's not like we're, I don't know, putting little children into swimming pools and they just naturally start swimming. I mean, you know, in the world of work, it is behavioral, you know, and I think that's the thing we keep coming back to here, right? We have to help people to shift this behavior.
I think there are some complexities here that are worth pulling apart, because you're right. I don't think most people are adequately prepared. So as an example, when people are being maybe targeted for promotion into management roles, sometimes they're given training. Sometimes that training is heavily focused on strategy because that's valued by the organization. And a lot of times it's not heavily focused on people management or even things like delegation.
Mm.
Or there might be a training that says, you should not micromanage. But then
Ah,
how does
thank
a
you.
person, right? Exactly. How does a
I'm
person
so glad I went on that one.
exactly. Did you attend
Stop
the,
that.
you must stop that behavior of micromanaging. Yes, exactly. Okay, I'll stop it. And then they don't know how to stop it because no one ever taught them how. It happens a lot.
Mm. What are some examples of this? I mean, I think it's such a relatable topic, and I'm sure we have some fun examples from our world of work. And I'm trying to think of like, what are some really sort of squirmy examples of micromanagement that we've seen in recent times?
The one that comes to mind for me, and it's more generic. I don't know if I have a specific example, but it's where The team member comes to the boss because they've encountered a problem, and the boss says, "Oh, let me solve that for you." And it seems like a really cool thing to do because if I'm the boss, I've seen this problem before, I know how to solve it. And I mean, meanwhile, I have this anxious employee who wants to get it solved, and it would be an act of generosity for them to just get my solution. But what do they learn by watching me hand them a solution? So I think that's the model of the behavior that it's so easy to fall into, and they fall into it all the time.
Hmm. I have a slightly more sinister one, I think.
Mm.
Well, sinister. Yeah. Painful. I think painful one. I coached this founder many years ago. Probably one of the most inspiring people I've worked with. Just in terms of like vision, purpose, like
Mm.
what was behind the business idea, everything. Amazing. Like it really is like, wow, extraordinarily compelling as a leader in terms of their why. And as I worked them over time, I started to sort of notice what I think we would call some micromanaging qualities. And we're talking earlier on about like the psychological aspect of this, right? And it's like this leader has put everything they have into this business,
Mm.
and it's a big business. We're talking, tens or hundreds of millions for a founder, a startup. And the thing that wasn't necessarily addressed in the beginning was how much fear there was about this thing not succeeding. And
Mm.
so it was pushing them into these kind of insane micromanaging conversations with their people. And after a while, it's like, this person's left. Yeah, they were ineffective. They were stupid. I got rid of them. They weren't doing things right. And this one's leaving too. Yeah, well, they were just totally incompetent. And after a while, I start to see the same things happening over and over. And there was a moment when it was like, maybe we need to put a mirror up here, because everywhere you go, there you are, kind of thing. And I think that level of micromanagement was really born out of fear. The leader was also like a super duper high performer. And so I think most people probably couldn't measure up anyway, but there was such a gap and there was such an opportunity to learn and have that be done differently. It was a cool
Yes.
gig. It ended better, but I think there was somebody who had been raised by other founders and leaders in that kind of way, that sort of very aggressive, critical, soul crushing, as you said before, that was how they had been led in their early career. And it was the only way they knew how to deal with stress.
Yeah. Well, the thing that's striking about that story too is the self-image of that leader and how central it is to the whole
Mm,
scenario. Like
mm,
it's kind of an example of like only I can fix this. Only I can do it right. And ultimately that's kind of a way of saying I'm the only one I can trust in this whole picture. Again, there might be legitimate reasons for some of that, but if that's your whole deal, you're going to be a really frustrating person to work for.
you're going to end up alone as well.
Yeah, because there isn't anybody else. So, one of the clues is if you hear somebody using that kind of language, like a lot of I, me kind of language, and there isn't much we going on, they're probably very isolated because they don't know how to collaborate. And they don't actually feel like collaboration is safe.
Mm.
So, that I think is a lot of the impulse here.
It makes me, I used to joke about this in my early coaching career when I was, working with leaders who were starting to do that sort of looking in the mirror bit, like, oh, maybe the problem is partly me kind of thing.
Huh.
And I remember saying to people, there's 7 billion and something people on the planet. And here's the mindset that doesn't work for a lot of leaders. If everybody would do it my way, we'd be fine. I'm like,
Right.
good. One down, 7 billion to go. Good luck. Like I have to
Yes.
convince everybody else in the world to see it my way. And, it's tongue in cheek. It's a little bit, provocative to say it like that to people. But there is an element of, if I live in a world where I wish everybody would do it my way, I
Hmm.
am never going to succeed.
I think this is really crucial. there's the mindset of I've solved it before, so I know how to solve it. And really, the truth is, okay, you have solved it before, but you only know one way to solve it. And I think for a lot of these leaders, that's not even part of their consciousness. I know the
Mm.
way. And
Mm.
therefore, and if you don't do it that way, or I see some signs that you're going to do it differently, I'm going to get anxious because I trust my own solution and I don't trust any other solutions that other than my own.
Analogy popped into my mind here. This is a little far out, but let me try it. So, when I was a kid, the first thing I learned to do in the kitchen was make cakes. My mom and my grandma taught me how to bake little cupcakes, and I did it again and again and again. I learned from them. Using your analogy, it's like, okay, show me how to make cakes and then let me go make them by myself. And
Mm,
so today I'll do different things. I'll make different twists. I'll try different flavors. And I think from a leadership style, like what you were saying before is true. And these are likely true statements. I've done this before and I've succeeded. But
right.
what we're looking for is that sort of culturally open part of, let me show you my way and let's see what you can do with it. Right?
Mm,
Go make your own cakes. Go find your own ways. And I think it's that bit. It's that sort of that bridge between what an individual knows and how willing or open they are to help other people learn and grow from that or build on it.
mm. Well, and just to take your analogy a step further, what if your mother and grandmother said every week, they said, here's a cake, here's a cake, here's a cake. Now you make one. Because I think that's what a lot of managers are doing. They're not actually taking you into the kitchen and showing you how to bake the cake, how to prepare the details of the recipe. They're just handing you the cake and then expecting you to figure out how they got there. And I think
Mm,
this is one of the crucial mistakes a lot of managers make in this picture is they don't actually think out loud in front of their people because it could be a little bit embarrassing to do. They don't actually reason through a problem in front of their team because again that can be a little bit vulnerable to do. They just hand the team solutions and then expect somehow magically the team understands how those solutions were arrived at. I think that's the big thing in micromanagement.
well, it's a great way to reinforce learned helplessness. I've just realized, if
Mm,
that was the experience I'd had, I would be very unhealthy and very lazy. I'd have a lot of
right,
cakes. But I think I
right.
think I think this is true. Like in the workplace, this is what happens. Right? If somebody
Yeah,
always gives me the answer, I'm just going to be a bit lazy,
yeah.
and I'm not going to be very motivated. I'm not going to learn a lot.
So this is one of those reasons why I think sometimes working for a micromanager is a little bit like watching a lot of TV. So I know it's going to sound like a weird analogy, but watching a little TV is okay. Watching a lot of TV over time starts to get depressing, but you won't necessarily notice how depressed you are from hours and hours of TV viewing because the beginning of the viewing actually feels pretty good. Oh, I can relax. I can just kind of watch the show. I
Mm,
think working for a micromanager is a lot like that. You get
mm,
handed a lot of solutions. So you don't have to think for yourself. You don't have to really work hard. You're not actually constructing anything yourself. You can rely on the manager to come up with these solutions. And then you just go and implement or, move on to the next thing and you get used to it. So then what do you know? Then how have you grown?
mm,
Over time, it's not fulfilling.
right. This is so good. That's a great analogy. And we want to create workplaces that are humanized. So we want to see workplaces where people are sharing information, where people are
Mhm.
supporting one another to grow, where people are leaning in for the sake of the team, for the sake of the organization. Like, how are we all rowing in the same direction? Or when can we? Sometimes we can't, and sometimes we shouldn't. How are we making space for those voices? And so, yeah, I think creating cultures in which individual contribution really does matter and a,
Mhm.
a level of patience, I think, is needed by a lot of leaders. Sometimes it's urgent. You have to tell people what to do. That's totally acceptable. But often it's not urgent. And those are the moments when you really want to be looking for how do you create an opportunity for somebody to grow, to thrive, to develop, to maybe fail and learn something new. And I think that's the invitation for leaders here. It's like, where are you on that spectrum? Is it an urgent situation? In which case, use your authority, use your knowledge, use your wisdom, get stuff done. But if it's not urgent, we're looking for those learning opportunities. And I think that's the space we want leaders to be looking in. Sometimes you do need to micromanage. There is a case for it. Most of the time, you don't.
I want to push back a little bit because many of the teams we work with push back in this way. So this is going to sound familiar to you.
Go for it.
Well, okay, you said sometimes it's okay to micromanage if it's urgent. In our office, it's always urgent. And this approach you're talking about of like letting people figure things out on their own, we don't have time for that. I've got to solve stuff right away.
Thank you, Chuck.
Workshop attendee right here.
Right. Also, workshop attendee flicking through their phone because they're bored, nothing to learn here.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
it's good too. Yes.
No, it's a good example. It's a good example of the stuff people push back on. And I think this is good. So, where do we point people in those moments, right? In those moments. First thing, I'm thinking, if everything's always urgent, you're probably doing something wrong because that becomes the culture. And actually, when people slow down and take a look, you can really pull these things apart. There are urgent things that are business critical. Maybe there's a financial pressure, there's an urgency to get something to market or a product out. Sure, those moments probably need people to be running at the front, leading, guiding, pointing people. Where this fails is if you've got one person at the top of the tree doing this and 50 people following and doing what they're told, you're missing opportunities for some of that pressure to filter down to other people and for some of that burden to be shared by other people. And even if it's one thing, a day, a week, an hour, whatever it is, there are opportunities to train people to take on some of that pressure. If that person at the top of the tree leaves the organization tomorrow, the whole thing crumbles because all of the knowledge and wisdom sits with one person. So leaders have a responsibility to figure out what are the things that they can pass over, that they can train other people in, that they can grow people in. And frankly, if they don't have the ability to do that, they're probably not in the right role.
That is correct.
Class over. Dismissed.
No, I think what I like is the forthrightness of your answer, and I like the kind of tough love approach of it. Of like, if you are falling into this trap, you're probably doing something wrong. And so, because it was such a great answer, I'm gonna throw another complexity in here. You mentioned creating an organizational culture. And I think in a lot of cases that culture already exists. So if I throw this example in, because we see this too. Yeah, this all makes sense, but I just lost a third of my team through layoffs. So we are all scrambling to take on a lot of work that was previously handled by full-time employees. We don't have the bandwidth to do things differently, try different approaches. I don't have time to train people. I don't have time to mentor people. I just have to put out fires. That's all I have to do is put out fires. Everything is on fire right now. It is urgent. It is a disaster. So this, and I do have answers here too, but I'm curious to know what you would say.
I would reflect back the language that was used. And I so recognize that kind of sort of counter argument. I've heard it many times. I know you have too. My instinct in that moment would be to reflect back. The use of the word I was much more prevalent than the use of the word we. So this is a leader who really does think and operate in a pretty much a solo mentality. I have to do this. I need to do this. We can't do it because I. They're not actually looking around at the we. And it's easy to say, just think differently. I get it. When people are doing 12, 16 hours a day, they're trying to survive. It does feel like you're in a hellhole. It does feel like you're fighting fire with fire with fire. I get it. We have a ton of compassion for this. The reality is, if people don't try to do something different, nothing will be different. But the first place I would look to that argument, and I'm curious to hear your, how you would address this too, but the leaders who look at what we need tend to be leaning into their peers, their colleagues, their team members to say, what do we do? We are, as you said, we lost a third of the team, or we've taken on a third of the business for somebody else. These things, sadly, they happen every day. It is a tragedy of the way a lot of organizations are working today that they put this burden on people. I think that resourceful leaders are going, all right, this sucks. What are our options? But notice our, not my.
Yeah.
And I think, there's lots of cheesy memes out there and so on, but it's kind of like, doing it together is easier than doing it alone. There's lots of those various examples out there. And, they're cheesy as anything, but they're also kind of true. So I think that where those leaders are looking and their default mindset is super important. So I would actually be reflecting that back. What would you do with this?
Yeah, I would definitely concur with you on a lot of what you just said. I especially like the idea of like, this sucks, sort of kind of acknowledging that we're in a difficult situation, and how can we solve this together? Because I do think that team members will rise to the occasion if they're included in the solutioning conversation. So, because it's kind of a double whammy if you're, yeah, a big part of your team gets laid off and the boss has already come up with a ready-made plan for you to, do double your workload or whatever the obligation is. Like, at least it's good to bring in the team, consult with them. They will have ideas about how to increase efficiency. So, love that. There's another piece of the picture here, and this is going to be a bit controversial, but I think we have to say it, which is organizations from the top down create all of this. When you make a decision to lay off that many people, it's not, people are resilient. They'll figure out ways to adapt, but this is not without serious psychological effect. This is causing a lot of emotional damage, and the leader has to figure that out. But it's very hard to solve a problem that you didn't create. I think there's something really, really wrong with these systems where companies they do the squeeze. All these middle managers have to figure out how to accommodate the squeeze, how to somehow cut costs, and then cut costs again, and then cut costs again, lay off as many people as they can. I mean, it's horrifying. And then expect people to be engaged, productive, and collaborative, and then innovate. Are you kidding? So I do think that there's a problem here, and I do get on a bit of a soapbox about it. But this, just to say stop micromanaging, is not enough. The other thing, I should pause here. I do have another thing, but let me pause here. Just see what you're making of what I said.
You are correct. No, you're right. And look, you being on your soapbox, it's valid. I think not enough people are saying it out loud. And yet everybody kind of knows it. Anybody who's not making those decisions knows it very viscerally. I don't think we've met anybody in the last 10 years whose work life is getting easier based on volume. So I think it's really true. We do want to be, inviting organizations to look more closely at the psychological impact of these kinds of demands on an organization. Unfortunately, for most of our client base being, listed companies, they have to manage budgets, they have to manage finance, they have to manage their share prices. So we understand, right? We see why these things happen. But there is definitely a call for much, much more attention to be paid to the impact, the unintended consequences of these often short-term approaches. People get hurt, productivity goes down.
Yes.
We lose knowledge, we lose institutional wisdom. Those impacts, it would be great to see some proper studies on this over time. I think there's more there, but yes, that would be my response to
Yeah.
what you're saying.
The impact is far beyond what I think most of these organizational leaders can comprehend. And so the result will often be more micromanaging because managers don't know how to deal with their stress in other ways. They haven't been adequately trained to figure it out. And so that they're just going to respond by micromanaging because they don't know what else to do. Now, along with this, we live this because what's the first thing? The first thing that happens when organizations go into cost cutting mode, what do they cut? One of the first things
Training,
they cut, yeah,
development.
the kind of work that we do, where we're actually helping people acquire the skills to manage more effectively, we're the first to go.
Any of our listeners working in L&D, we feel you, brothers and sisters. We really do.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really hard for the L&D departments. It's like really devastating for them because they're often staffed by incredibly passionate people who really understand the value of the kind of work we do working with upskilling these leaders. It's crucial, and it's the first thing that gets cut. So on one hand, I'm going to get rid of some significant portion of your workforce, which is going to throw you into a tailspin of stress, anxiety, heartache, because it's painful too, and obligation, because I'm upping what you're obligated to deliver. And also the ability to acquire the skills to manage that's going away too. We're not gonna pay for that. So what are we doing here?
Yeah, and this happens because people look at costs. People look at external costs usually for training and development, and they go, yeah, it's too significant right now. We have to cut costs. And it's true. It is often a costly undertaking. It's never costly when you look at what it means for an organization to have to lose people, to rehire them, retrain new ones, the loss of institutional knowledge, and so on. So it's often a false economy. Nevertheless, this is the conversation that we are seeing. Thankfully, more and more companies are taking it seriously. They are looking at this going, we need to look out for people's well-being. We need to look out for people's abilities to be psychologically safe, giving people opportunities to learn and grow through these difficult circumstances. And so it isn't all darkness and misery, but it is a conversation that I think will still be around for at least our lifetime. It is getting better, but I think we have a way to go.
Maybe I'm more cynical than you about this. Is it getting better? I don't know. I think so. In some ways, it's getting better. It's getting better in that companies they understand the importance of this kind of training. They understand the importance of giving people support and helping them acquire skills. So I do think that is generally true. And these same companies that understand this and value this will also put it first on the chopping block when things get tight. So I don't know if it's better.
I think it's better in the sense if you and I go back like 10 or 15 years, I think very far fewer companies are having these conversations. It certainly used to be if you have a micromanaging boss, suck it up. At some point they'll move on or you'll move on, you'll be okay. I think today far more people are calling it out. More people feel empowered to go to HR and say I'm struggling with this leader, or leaders are being called out directly by their subordinates. Like there is often enough of a culture where people can raise it, where people say, actually, this is not acceptable. I do think in that perspective,
Yeah.
on more of an individual level, it is shifting. I mean, I was brought in 5 or 6 years ago to work with a leader who was doing phenomenally well in his role, but half of his team loved him and half of the team were terrified of him.
Yeah.
It was just a personality style. And he was busted by a couple of people who turned down, I think, job offers after interviews because they mentioned his style to the HR department. And what I really appreciated about the way this organization handled this was they had a conversation with him and they invited him to reflect on it and ask what he thought would help. And he was like, well, I didn't know this. He was grateful for the feedback and he asked for a coach.
Yeah.
And so I think, and we did some great work together. It was it was humbling. It was really humbling. He really didn't know upfront, but it was not, it was sincere. He really didn't know. And when he had that knowledge, he worked very, very hard to grow and to evolve. And I think this was a great example of an organization saying, if this person doesn't change this behavior, it's probably not going to be okay for us in the long run. Let's create an environment where we can do that. And I sort of go back to the cost or not costly approach
Yeah.
of this. That engagement probably cost them a small sum. It was an awful lot cheaper than him losing 2 or 3 team members because they found him aggressive.
Right.
And I think this is where we want people to see that sort of that value cycle. But back to your point, it is changing, and I think there's a lot more change needed. It would be great if this would become really cultural instead of just more like individual. But I do see that coaching is often the way around this. If people can make enough space for leaders to learn, it's often a
Yeah.
really effective way to address it.
Well, I think one of the things that's cool in your story is in this case, you had somebody who was able to get feedback. Somehow the organization was able to deliver him the feedback and he was able to hear it. One thing that is really encouraging is I hear many more leaders these days acknowledging that they have a problem with micromanagement. Like they know they have this behavior. They don't necessarily know how to stop it, but they know they have it. So I think that's a good sign. Like, what's the
Yeah,
first stage of a cure is knowing you have the disease, right? So
right.
I think this is true. The other thing in your story that I think also gives me hope is in most cases, some version of coaching is going to be the answer. So, like in this case, having this person receive coaching directly from an experienced coach, really, really helpful to overcome the behavior. But I also think in a lot of cases, and this is a big part of the work we do, it's giving coaching skills to managers. Because if you as a manager understand the skills and mindsets of coaching, that is probably one of the easiest ways to overcome micromanaging.
I agree. As I was listening to you, I was thinking, like I'm old enough to have started work at a time when people still smoked in the office. Can you imagine? People still smoked in the office.
Wow.
Um, I know, right? And now it's like it would be a it would be a fireable offense, I would say, probably in most places. But
Yeah.
like how things have changed, and I think this is my sort of dream here, and I do think it's totally attainable. I do think that within a generation or so, it will be so unfashionable to be a micromanager, to be a bully, because it is so normal for cultures to have created an environment where people can receive feedback in a way that is helpful,
Mhm.
not feedback which is painful or critical or upsetting, but feedback which is intended to be supportive, to be compassionate, to be psychologically safe, that allows people like the client I shared the example of before to actually go, oh, okay, I have an opportunity here. I can grow with this. So my vision and my dream, and I do think this
Mhm.
is definitely reachable, is that it becomes as unfashionable to micromanage as it was to smoke at your desk.
Ow. I like it. I like it. And again,
Yeah.
I think, yes, and I think that a big piece of this is we need to find a lot of creative ways to get managers to behave more like coaches.
Yes.
I think this
And I
is
think,
this is a big secret. Yeah.
yeah. And I think if you're listening to this, and you manage people, maybe it's just a question to ask yourself, like, how am I doing with that really? Like, do I give people space? Do I tend to over control a little bit? And we would absolutely, accept that for the most part, this is only because of people feeling under pressure or people feeling that they don't have any alternative. I guess it's just a good reflection point. Like, what are my options really here? Am I leaning into people or my community around me as much as I could? Is there room for me to do more? Is there
Mhm.
somebody I trust who I can ask for feedback from? Like any of the above, I think it's good. Just changing the conversation a little bit on these things would go a long way. And yeah, a good coaching conversation could really be helpful too.
Yeah. Well, and I find myself saying to groups of managers, invest now or pay later. Like you could invest a few minutes right now in supporting somebody in gaining some new abilities, or you could just solve the problem for them and then later pay the price that you didn't train them,
Mm,
that you didn't
mm.
adequately prepare them. Right.
So
So
true.
at some point, the investment has to happen, you know, and if your mindset is not now because we're too busy cutting costs, then when are you not cutting costs?
Mm. That's
Right.
so true.
When is it ever a bad time to take a few extra moments and support someone to figure something out on their own, or to give someone a little bit of space?
It reminds me of that old saying, people join companies, but they leave people. And I think this is a true example here too, right? So don't be the person that people leave, friends. Um,
Don't be that
humanizing the
boss.
work, right? Humanizing the workplace, one conversation at a time. Um, Look around, check on the people around you. How are you doing with them? How are they doing with you? Is there room? Is there an opportunity to do a little better, make someone's day just that little bit easier?
Well, and I also think about, that story I told about walking into those offices and having people say, "Oh, thank goodness the boss isn't here today. We're getting so much done."
Mm,
Wouldn't it be great if the boss knew that that was happening? Like, what if you actually knew that your employees were relieved on the days you didn't come into the office because they knew they could be more productive? What if you knew that? How would you behave differently as the manager in that situation?
that's a good one. Yeah. If that's true for you, what does it say about you?
Yeah. And if it is true for you, how would you know?
This is good. It's been fun exploring this topic with you, Chuck.
As
That,
always.
as always, so folks, micromanagement on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you doing with it? Something to think about.
All right, that's all for now.
That's all for now. Stay safe, stay kind, and stay human.